And I call the honourable member for Murray.
I thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. This is a very important bill. We know that Australia can produce some of the best food and fibre of any nation. We also know we have some of the highest costs of production. We know that, of course, is related to our costs of labour, but a lot of it is also related to the input costs of things like farm chemicals. And unfortunately, the red tape that has surrounded the whole business of applying for the use of those chemicals, for them to be approved in this country, has been made much worse under the previous government when they introduced different legislation, which now we must amend by removing reapproval and re-registration. And that's the bill we debate tonight, Agriculture and Veterinary Chemicals Legislation Amendment, Removing Reapproval and Re-registration Bill 2014. Now, we have, of course, in Australia, one of the best reputations of chemical-free production. Of course, we have to use some chemicals to manage pests and diseases, but we have such a stringent regime in Australia and such well-credentialed primary producers that it is extraordinarily rare. In fact, I can't think of a single case where any of our products on the shelves in Australia that's made, produced, grown, manufactured in Australia or from Australia exported to another country have been held up as chemically contaminated. We have an extraordinarily good and fearsomely defended reputation. But we can't be bogged down in the additional red tape that Labor imposed upon us. We're not quite sure why. They just had a frenzy of additional regulation, additional layers of bureaucrats, took more time to do the job and made it even more expensive for farm or food producers to do their job. So this is a very important bill indeed. It, of course, came out of the very careful and close inquiries that examined the Agriculture and Veterinary Chemicals Legislation Amendment Bill 2012. And there was a dissenting report, not unsurprisingly, which looked at and said, we believe one of the bill's key modifications, the intention to install a system of mandatory re-registration, lacks sufficient justification and is likely to create a new layer of compliance and bureaucracy on the pesticide and veterinary medicines industry without demonstrable improvements in efficiency or outcomes, and that extra costs will be passed along to Australian farmers. Well, I say hear to that. That's exactly what it was going to do. And fortunately, we've come into Parliament, into power as a coalition in time before too much damage could be done with that Labor bill. Tonight we set things right. Now, in case you, as Australian consumers perhaps listening to this, are not aware of the problems of chemical contamination in other food supplies or food chains elsewhere in the world, let me remind you that more than 3 million hectares of China's farmland is now too polluted with heavy metals and other chemicals to use for growing food. This is a Chinese cabinet official said on Monday, highlighting a problem that is causing growing public concern. And this article was published in December 2013. The threat from pollution to China's food supply has been overshadowed by public alarm at smog and water contamination, but is gaining attention following scandals over tainted rice and other crops. The government triggered complaints in February when it refused to release results of a nationwide survey of soil pollution, declaring them a state secret. The figure given at a news conference by Wang Xuan, a Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Land and Resources, would be about 2% of China's arable land, the figures given by that Deputy Minister. Excuse me. Some scientists have given higher estimates of as much as 24.3 million hectares, or 1/6 of the total of arable land, though it is unclear how much of that would be totally contaminated, too contaminated for farming. Clearly, we in Australia have to jealously guard our low risk, practically zero risk of chemical contamination of our arable land. We have to make sure that we don't compromise our current clean green credentials with things like the insatiable search for coal seam gases, which we are not yet sure about in terms of groundwater contamination and ultimately perhaps soil contamination as the contaminated aquifers are brought to the surface and ponded on what was arable farmland. We've got to watch that issue very closely as a nation. And I have enormous sympathy for the people in agriculture right now fighting the good fight on places like the most arable parts around, for example, the parts of Queensland and into New South Wales around the Tamworth area. The explosive growth of Chinese industry, the overuse of farm chemicals and lax environmental enforcement have led to the swathes of the countryside tainted by lead, cadmium, pesticides and other toxins. The whole business of Chinese chemical contamination of their food chain came home in just February, March this year, when SPC Admona became very concerned to find that the lead contamination in cans of peaches imported from China was so high that they were a risk to human consumption, particularly for the young or for the elderly. And a lot of that canned peach came in the 3 kilogram sizes, which are typically bought by the food services sector, say for aged care, hospitals, prisons, the Defence Forces. And of course the consumer in those circumstances, the elderly lady or the armed force personnel or people in custody, have no knowledge of where the food is from when it's served to them in their meals. But we have found that chemical contamination of those canned peaches, the lead contamination was way above what is safe for human consumption. So you have to ask, how did that chemically, in this case heavy metal contaminated product, get into Australia, given we also claim to have, besides very important veterinary and chemical legislation, we are supposed to have very, very sound and rigorous testing of our food in terms of any additives, contaminants such as pesticides, antibiotics, microorganisms and metals. And of course we have a whole industry. Food standards are described in the Australian-New Zealand Food Standards Code. It applies to all foods produced or imported for sale in Australia and New Zealand. And as I say, this code is rigorous. It includes standards for labelling and additives and contaminants. So how does some of this product get onto our shelves, in particular gets fed to our most vulnerable? And of course there's a huge cost incentive to pick it up and sell it into the food services sector because, for example, a 3 kilo tin of imported peaches sells for some $6 in Australia compared to $9 for the Australian-made product, and there's a huge incentive there to cut costs if you're in one of those sectors like aged care or a hospital. So we test for a whole range of contaminants, particularly chemicals, but I am concerned that our testing regime under Labor was compromised with cutting in costs and with a very tiny proportion of foods that are being tested. Surveillance foods are all imported foods that are not considered risk foods. Now, how it works, risk foods, I should start again. When risk foods are imported by a new importer or from a new manufacturer, 100% of these shipments are tested, and the risk foods are detained by customs for testing and are not released until the test results are returned. But once there are 5 consecutive shipments passed, in other words, no problems with them, all tests, at all tests, the rate of testing drops to 25% of shipments. After 20 consecutive shipments have passed this 25% of sampling, the testing rate drops to 5% of shipments only. Now, if you're a clever importer, of course you make sure those first number of shipments are absolutely first class. They're from uncontaminated areas, perhaps in China. They're from perhaps other country sources re-exported out of your country, to make sure they pass those first tests. Because once you've got to that magic figure of only 5% of your imports being tested, then virtually anything goes. These shipments are not held until the test results are known, but they do pass through customs. If the food fails a test from the Department of Agriculture, one of these 5%, then the relevant food regulatory authorities can do a product recall, but it's at the authority's discretion. And of course, once a surveillance food fails a test, then future shipments from that importer and manufacturer are increased back to the 100% rate, and so that system starts again, till you get down once more to just 5% of your products being tested because you've had 5 consecutive shipments pass all tests. That must be how the Chinese contaminated product got through, I presume. I presume if it was properly tested for contamination, it would have been found. Clearly those samples were not tested. I'm most anxious that our regime within Australia, our own agricultural and veterinary chemicals legislation, is the best in the world. It needs to be, because when we say a product is produced or grown or manufactured in Australia, and it is genuinely so because our labelling laws of course allow a lot of misinformation to pass into the public arena, and that's another issue we as a coalition must deal with. The fact that Codus Alimentaris allows if 50% of the value of the product has been met or has been incurred in Australia, and that includes labour, overheads, all of those values, you can call the product made in Australia. That should not be the case. If it's more than 50% transformed in Australia, like for example, if your fish comes in frozen from Thailand but is crumbed in Melbourne, then you can call that made in Australia as well. So we have those labelling problems which can mask serious contamination issues as well. But I'm concerned in this, obviously, this debate about chemical contamination. We've got to make sure that when a consumer, whether they are in United States, Canada, China, Singapore, when they see product of Australia, for them they feel totally assured that that product does not have any chemical contamination, that it's some of the cleanest and safest to be found anywhere in the world, that they're prepared to pay a premium for that high value added product, say if it's a baby food or a food for the elderly. That's what we're aiming for in Australia. We do not need our agribusiness industry to be tied down, shackled, and cost imposts forced upon them through what Labor tried to do. This amendment gives us still one of the most stringent and vigorous agricultural and veterinary chemical legislative regimes in the world. I commend that. That is a very important thing that we do. All of the safeguards will remain in place in terms of making sure that nothing gets past the APVMA. It will retain all powers to recall unsafe chemical products or suspend or cancel the registration of a chemical product if they may no longer meet criteria for registration. In fact, these provisions were recently strengthened and streamlined by the Amendment Act. So, as a representative of the Food Bowl of Australia, which supplies more than 25% of dairy produce of Australia, more than 80% of our pears, more than 90% of Australia's kiwi fruit, which supplies the best beef product that can be found in Australia, the best oilseeds, I am most concerned that our government does away with all of the rubbish that was put through by the previous government, which did not understand anything beyond the tram tracks, beyond metropolitan Australia. And so I commend most heartily this agricultural and veterinary chemicals legislation amendment, removing reapproval and re-registration Bill 2014, and I hope that it has a very speedy passage through both this and the other House. I thank you.
I thank the member.